April 29, 1945, the outskirts of Berlin. Smoke coiled upward from the ruins of the Reich Chancellery as Soviet troops moved through the shattered streets. The stench of burnt oil and concrete dust hung thick in the air. Captain Ivan Yegorovitch of the Red Army's Technical Intelligence Unit adjusted his gas mask, stepping carefully over debris as he entered a small aircraft hangar on the edge of the city. Inside, beneath a roof half collapsed by Allied bombing, stood the remnants of something extraordinary, a pair of sleek silver-gray aircraft unlike anything he had seen before. Their wings were thin and swept. Their engines, mounted beneath the fuselage, were not propeller-driven. No spinning blades, no familiar roar. Only the strange, quiet menace of innovation. Stenciled on the wrecked fuselage were the words Messerschmitt Me 260U. Nearby, Soviet engineers in brown overalls were already prying open panels, sketching components, murmuring in disbelief. "This one flew?" one of them whispered. Yegorovitch nodded. It had flown, and it had fought. The Germans had done what the rest of the world only dreamed of. They had created the jet fighter. Outside, the thunder of Soviet artillery still rolled through Berlin's ruins. But in that dim hangar, the sound that mattered most was the hiss of acetylene torches cutting apart the Me-262. Every bolt, every circuit, every fragment was packed into crates marked for shipment east, to Moscow, to Gorky, to Novosibirsk. By the time the war ended, Soviet convoys loaded with captured technology were crossing the border daily. Among them were engines, blueprints, and captured scientists, jet turbines, compressor blades, fuel pumps. Each piece was a secret to be unwrapped. But not everyone in Moscow believed in this new era. At the NII-1 Aeronautical Research Institute, chief designer Artem Mikoyan sat in a dim office, reviewing intelligence reports. The Me-262 specs were almost unbelievable. 870 km/h top speed, 30mm cannons, and a ceiling far beyond the Yak or Laggy fighters then in service. Across his desk, Mikhail Gurevich, his partner and co-designer, frowned skeptically. "Comrade Mikoyan," he said, "the party says we won't have jet power for another decade. The engines are unreliable. The metals are too scarce. We can't risk our production on unproven ideas." Mikoyan didn't look up. He simply tapped the report's final line, the words scrawled by a Soviet observer in Germany. "The future of air combat has no propellers." By summer 1945, Soviet command issued a directive to every design bureau. Begin jet research immediately. The task was monumental. The USSR had little experience with high-temperature alloys or centrifugal compressors. The British had the Rolls-Royce Welland. The Americans had the P-80 Shooting Star. The Soviets? Nothing but fragments. Still, from those fragments, Mikoyan's team began to build. They worked out of a drafty hangar at Factory 155, a former propeller fighter plant outside Moscow. The first months were chaos. They had no working jet engine of their own, only German Jumo 004s salvaged from wreckage, and even those broke down after a few hours of operation. Engineers scavenged materials wherever they could. One recalled melting down German scrap metal in old foundry vats to make turbine blades. Another spent weeks modifying airframes of piston aircraft just to test airflow around the new engines. But despite shortages, there was a feverish energy in the air. The war had taught them that technological surprise could decide empires, and now the next race was already underway, not for territory, but for speed. One cold morning in late 1945, Mikoyan gathered his engineers before a chalkboard. He drew a simple outline: twin engines mounted under a fuselage, a pressurized cockpit, 37 mm cannon in the nose. "This," he said quietly, "will be the MiG-9, the first Soviet jet fighter." The room fell silent. No one dared say that it was impossible. January 1946. Factory number 155, Moscow. The air inside the workshop was sharp with a scent of acetone and welding fumes. Sparks burst like fireflies across the concrete floor as engineers cut, riveted, and reshaped the skeleton of what would become the Soviet Union's first jet fighter. Outside, the snow fell in thick sheets, muffling the hum of generators. Inside, time moved differently. "Comrade Mikoyan, the compressor blade is cracking again," shouted engineer Alexei Grigoriev, clutching a bent fragment of steel. "The Jumo tolerances, these metals won't hold." Mikoyan ran a hand through his dark hair, eyes narrowing. "Then find something that does hold," he said. "We are not waiting for the West to show us how." In truth, they had no real choice. The Soviet aviation industry had been exhausted by years of war. Skilled metallurgists were scarce, alloys even scarcer. The captured German Jumo 04 and BMW 3 engines were the only templates they had, and the factories barely had the tools to reproduce them. Every few hours, another test engine seized or melted down under stress. Still, the engineers pressed on. They worked in shifts that lasted through the night, eating bread crusts and black tea between tests. On the drafting tables, new sketches appeared daily: revised wing routes, intake shapes, engine, mount reinforcements. The aircraft they were building wasn't just a prototype, it was a declaration. In one corner of the hangar, Sergei Lozino-Lozinsky, a young aerodynamicist, studied a captured Me-262 wing section under a single lamp. He scribbled notes: "Too heavy, drag too high, try thinner profile." Across the hall, machinists hammered out the first pressurized cockpit frame the USSR had ever produced. It leaked constantly, but it was progress. At night, Mikoyan and Gurevich stayed behind long after the others had gone. They pored over German technical documents, translating words they barely understood: Schubhause, Luftstrom, Stahllegierung. Sometimes they simply guessed. "Imagine," Gurevich muttered one evening, staring at a diagram of a centrifugal compressor, "the Americans think we'll be flying prop planes for the next 10 years." Mikoyan smiled faintly. "Then let's make sure they're wrong." By spring, a crude fuselage took shape on the factory floor. Bare metal, twin nacelles under the wings, a squat nose with a massive intake. It looked ungainly, brutish even, but to the Soviet engineers it was beautiful. They christened it I-300, the internal designation for what would later be called MiG-9. The first taxi tests were a symphony of danger. On a gray April morning, test pilot Alexei Grinchik climbed into the cockpit wearing a leather flight jacket and fur collar. The engine startup was deafening. Two German-derived RD-20 jet engines whining up from a deep growl to a banshee scream. The airfield filled with smoke and the acrid smell of kerosene. As Grinchik eased the throttle forward, the aircraft began to move, slowly at first, then faster. Snow and ice shot out from the wheels. The roar grew until even the officers in the control truck covered their ears. At 140 km/h, the nose lifted. The MiG-9 trembled, its control surfaces fluttering violently. For a moment it looked like the entire machine would tear itself apart. But then, suddenly, silence. The wheels left the ground. The aircraft climbed steady and sure into the pale Moscow sky. The engineers on the ground erupted into cheers. Some shouted, others simply stood in stunned disbelief. It was April 24th, 1946, less than a year after the fall of Berlin, and the Soviet Union had just entered the jet age. But the celebration was short-lived. Minutes into the flight, Grinchik radioed down. "Comrades, I have instability in the nose. Controls are heavy, very heavy." A pause, static, then his calm voice again. "Engine's overheating. I'll bring her down." The MiG-9 thudded back onto the runway, bouncing once before sliding to a stop. Steam hissed from the engine bays. The mechanics rushed forward, dousing the nacelles with fire extinguishers. When they pulled open the panels, they found the alloy had softened and warped under the heat. Mikoyan said nothing. He just looked at the blackened metal, then at his exhausted team. "We'll fix it," he said. "We'll make it fly again." And they did. By the summer of 1946, the MiG-9 was flying regular test sorties, unstable, unreliable, but undeniably fast. Western intelligence would not believe the reports. When they came in, the Soviets had a working jet fighter. August 1946, Chukovsky Airfield, southeast of Moscow. The sun glared off the runway, turning the MiG-9's bare metal skin into a mirror of blinding light. The aircraft looked menacing now, streamlined, purposeful, its twin jet engines slung low under the fuselage like clenched fists. Mechanics in oil-stained coveralls scurried beneath it, checking pressure gauges and fuel lines. A group of officers in long leather coats stood nearby, watching. Among them was Artem Mikoyan, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Test pilot Alexei Grinchik climbed the ladder into the cockpit once again. The canopy clanged shut behind him. Sweat already rolled down his temples, though the morning air was cool. He ran his gloved hands across the unfamiliar instruments: fuel pressure, turbine temperature, thrust control. Everything about this jet was experimental. Every flight was a gamble. "ZH-3 control, this is MiG prototype. Engines starting now." The turbines whined, low and angry. The sound built and built until it became a shriek that rolled across the airfield. Engineers backed away, shielding their faces from the blast of exhaust that scorched the grass behind the jet. The radio crackled. "MiG prototype cleared for takeoff." Grinchik throttled up. The MiG-9 surged forward, heavy at first, then light, lifting off at 210 kilometers per hour. The ground dropped away beneath him. The first Soviet jet fighter was airborne once more. From the tower, Mikoyan watched as the silver speck cut across the sky. The contrail was faint, almost invisible. A year ago, no one in Moscow had thought this possible. Now it was real. At 6,000 meters, Grinchik tested the controls. The aircraft shuddered in turns, the twin engines trailing faint black smoke. "Vibration in port engine," he reported. "Otherwise stable." Then, at full throttle, the MiG-9 streaked forward and, for the first time, broke 900 kilometers per hour. The Soviet engineers below erupted in applause. When Grinchik landed an hour later, he stepped out grinning. Grease streaked across his face. "She's heavy," he said, "but she flies like a bullet." That night, vodka flowed freely in the canteen. The design bureau's men and women, draftsmen, welders, test pilots, celebrated until dawn. For one moment, exhaustion and shortages and politics all faded away. They had done it, but triumph came with a shadow. A month later, during high-altitude trials, tragedy struck. The MiG-9 was being pushed to its limits: maximum speed, high climb rates, extreme dives. On a cloudless morning in April 1947, Grinchik took off once more, testing a new tail configuration. The radio tracked his climb past 10,000 meters, then static. Ground crews watched in horror as the jet reappeared, tumbling end over end, trailing smoke. There was no ejection system. None had been developed yet. Seconds later, the MiG-9 slammed into a frozen field outside the airfield perimeter. Silence, then a column of black smoke rising into the pale sky. Grinchik was gone. Mikoyan arrived within minutes, boots crunching through the snow. He knelt beside the wreckage, the twisted metal still hot to the touch. For a long time he said nothing. Then quietly, to no one in particular, he gave his life for the jet age. In the days that followed, work continued, grimly, relentlessly. Test flights resumed with another pilot, Vladimir Yuganov, who pushed the surviving prototypes to their limits. Failures were constant, engine flameouts, compressor stalls, cockpit fires. But so were the victories, faster climbs, smoother handling, improved armament. By late 1947, the MiG-9 had achieved what once seemed impossible: operational readiness. It could fly faster and higher than any propeller-driven Soviet fighter. Armed with twin 23mm cannons and a single 37mm Noodleman gun, it was designed to tear through the sky with brutal efficiency. And when first production models rolled off the line at Factory Number 1 in Kuibyshev, Soviet officials finally allowed a glimpse to the world. At the Tushino Air Show on August 3, 1947, Western military attachés shaded their eyes as an unfamiliar silver jet screamed overhead. No markings, no insignia, just the rising howl of its engines as it passed the stands in a low, blistering dive. "Good God," one British officer muttered, "they've done it." In the crowd, Mikoyan stood in silence, hands clasped behind his back. Around him, party officials clapped and cheered, but he was already thinking ahead, to the next design, the next leap forward. The MiG-9 was a triumph, yes, but he knew it was only a beginning. Because while the MiG-9 had proven the Soviet Union could build a jet fighter, its flaws were many: engine surges, limited range, primitive systems. To stay ahead, they would need something better, faster, deadlier. And so, in a quiet corner of the design bureau, the first sketches began to appear for what would soon replace it: an aircraft that would define the jet age for decades to come, the MiG-15. Winter 1948, Moscow, USSR. Snow blanketed the courtyard of Factory No. 135, muffling the crunch of boots as engineers filed into the hangar. Inside, the MiG-9 prototypes sat in a neat row, their silver skins dull from flight fatigue and frost. The once proud machines, the pioneers of Soviet jet power, now seemed old, almost obsolete, though barely 2 years had passed since their first flight. In the far corner, a new airframe was taking shape. Its wings were swept back at a sharper angle, its fuselage more slender. Where the MiG-9 looked brutish, this one looked hungry. The chalk on the wall beside it read, I-310. It would soon bear a new name, the MiG-15. But before that legend could rise, the MiG-9 still had a story to finish. For all its flaws, the MiG-9 had achieved what Stalin demanded: proof that Soviet industry could create a jet fighter from nothing but captured technology and determination. In 1947 and 1948, over 600 MiG-9s were built and deployed to frontline units of the VVS, Soviet Air Forces. They flew patrols over the western borders, their twin engines screaming through dawn skies above East Germany and Poland. To Western observers, it was a shock. Reports from British intelligence declassified years later described the MiG-9 as an astonishing leap for a country presumed technologically backward. The jet could reach speeds of 9–10 km/h and climb faster than any piston fighter before it. But it came at a cost. The early engines, derived from the fragile German BMW So-3 design, were unstable, prone to flameouts if the pilot fired his cannons too long. The gun gases sucked into the intakes could starve the turbines of oxygen, causing them to stall mid-flight. Many pilots learned this the hard way. At Leningrad Air Regiment No. 127, Lieutenant Pavel Grebenshchikov recalled, "We loved her power, but she was a beast. She demanded respect. Fire the 37 too long, and you'd hear the cough, then silence, and suddenly you were gliding a dead weight back to earth." Still, those who flew her felt a fierce pride. The MiG-9 represented something far greater than metal and machinery. It was proof that the Soviet Union could match the West in innovation. The pilots called it the Fargo, though that nickname would later be given by NATO. To them, it was simply MiG. At dawn, patrols over the Baltic, the jet's engines left pale ribbons of vapor across the sky. Below, villagers would pause in their fields and look up, watching the silver streaks vanish into the clouds. For many, it was the first visible sign that the war's destruction had given birth to something new, a future powered by speed. Back in Moscow, Mikoyan and Gurevich weren't celebrating. They were dissecting. In a cramped office filled with blueprints and cigarette smoke, they reviewed flight reports, failures, and pilot feedback. Every flaw in the MiG-9 became a line in the next design. "Engines must be higher," said Gurevich, sketching rapidly. "No more gas ingestion from the guns." "Swept wings," Mikoyan added, gesturing toward a captured German study on high-speed airflow. "This will give us transonic performance." "And the engine?" "We'll use the British one," Mikoyan replied quietly. "The Rolls-Royce Nene." It was a bold move. In a stunning act of post-war diplomacy and naivete, Britain had agreed to sell the USSR several Nene turbojets, unaware that Soviet engineers would reverse engineer them almost immediately. Within months, the RD-45, an exact copy, was running on test stands outside Moscow. By spring 1948, the Design Bureau had already begun assembling the prototype of their next-generation jet, the one that would make the MiG name famous across the world. But even as attention shifted to the MiG-15, the MiG-9 continued to serve as a bridge, a transitional weapon between the propeller and the supersonic age. In training units across the Soviet Union, young pilots cut their teeth on it, learning how to manage jet thrust, engine temperatures, and the alien sensation of near-silent acceleration. For many, that first takeoff in the MiG-9 was unforgettable. "No roar of propellers," one pilot wrote in his journal. "Only wind and the scream of the turbines behind you. It felt like flying the future." In 1949, as production of the MiG-9 quietly ended, the first MiG-15s were already streaking down the same runways. The world would soon see them over Korea, where they would challenge the best aircraft the West could field, and often win. The MiG-9 faded into history, overshadowed by its faster, deadlier descendants. But within the Soviet archives, one photograph still stood sitting framed in Mikoyan's office, a grainy image of the first prototype lifting off from a snowy runway, exhaust trailing behind like twin comets. Underneath, in his own handwriting, he had scrawled a single line. From this, everything began. The MiG-9 was never perfect, but it was first, born from the ashes of Berlin forged in desperation, it was the machine that proved Soviet engineering could rival the West. It bridged the gap between the prop-driven fighters of World War II and the screaming jets of the Cold War. And when that first MiG-9 took off in 1946, the West realized something chilling. The Soviet Union would never again be technologically behind.